What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of China. On here, we discuss geopolitical developments, economic, political, and everything in between, and touch increasingly on military as we see a more aggressive posturing around China's territorial periphery. So if that is something that you are interested in, and if you want to be just as informed as my clients, maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, thank you so much for your patience, guys. I'm sorry that I couldn't put up a video over the weekend. I had a business trip. It was great, actually. It was very productive. I'm back, I'm well rested, and I'm ready for another week. There's some very interesting developments that have happened over the weekend and earlier in the week, so this midweek episode I think should be interesting. You may have noticed that I had a haircut. It actually happened today, a haircut with Chinese characteristics, so please try not to be too distracted by the hairdo that I'm sporting at the moment. Hopefully it will grow out in a few days. Now, as always, guys, if you enjoy the content, it's a massive help if you smash the like button. Really, it tells the algorithm that this is legitimate content, and unfortunately this channel is not recommended by YouTube because apparently it touches on sensitive topics. I don't understand why, but that's the reality. So a like does go a big way, and if you want to go that extra mile, my Patreon is in the description below. But without any further ado, guys, let's just jump into this week's China update. Okay, first up, guys, on Sunday, China and 14 other nations in the Asia Pacific officially formed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP for short, now the world's biggest free trading bloc, accounting for almost a third of all economic activity globally. RCEP is a free trade agreement in the Asia Pacific between the 10 ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nation States, and 5 of their free trade agreement partners: Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. Some have called RCEP China's answer to TPP, but China did not conceive or lead the negotiations of RCEP, though it was very happy, I'm sure, to get the agreement over the line, and did eventually make big concessions, for example, removing 86% of tariffs on imports from Japan. The development over the weekend, the passing of RCEP, was trumpeted in People's Republic of China state-run media. Xinhua said, quote, "Covering a region with a combined gross domestic product, GDP, of $26.2 trillion US, or about 30% of global GDP, the RCEP agreement is an unprecedented, modern, comprehensive, high quality, and reciprocal mega regional trading arrangement that accommodates the broadest possible interests, conditions, and priorities of different countries. The signing marks a new milestone in regional economic integration in East Asia." End quote. Chinese and many in the Anglophone media alike have been trumpeting this as a huge win for China, and yet another sign of China taking the lead while the US retreats from agreements like the TTP, now called the CPTPP, and the global trading system generally. While Beijing no doubt is very pleased with RCEP, these characterizations that we've seen in the media are very overblown. We should only view RCEP as a modest multinational trade bloc in Asia, and China's victory purely symbolic. With India leaving the negotiations, RCEP does very little to reduce tariffs because among the signatory countries, tariffs were already very low. Remember, this originally started as an agreement between the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and parties that it has free trade agreements with already. So the only exception in terms of massive reductions in trade barriers are between China and Japan. We should also keep in mind that China's consumer market, contrary to popular opinion, is actually quite small relative to its GDP, and isn't strong enough to maintain its own growth, let alone a wider trade group. While the US is a net importer, China is a net exporter. And ironically, while this agreement will likely advance supply chain integration in the region, for many, America will remain the end market. Peking University finance professor and China economy expert Michael Pettis called the media excitement about RCEP just more, quote, "the world is changing nonsense," end quote, and pointed out, quote, "The RCEP countries together have been running current account surpluses of more than 2% in their collective GDP. And except perhaps in the cases of Australia and New Zealand, these surpluses are based on structural savings imbalances. They are consequently very hard to eliminate without politically difficult domestic adjustments that none of them want to accept. This means that RCEP can only function as a trade bloc either if some of its members are forced into running deficits, in practice only Australia and New Zealand, but they are too small to absorb more than a small fraction of the total, or if the RCEP is simply a surplus trading bloc in search of counterparts willing to run large deficits." He goes on to say, quote, "Unless the RCEP explains what each country is going to do to bring their collective trade into balance, it is just a bunch of countries in a Wikipedia article," end quote. Several American media outlets are reporting this week that the White House is planning to push through hardline policies on China before the end of the administration. The Chinese side also anticipates such a move. On Monday, state-run Global Times, quoting several mainland professors, published an article entitled, quote, "Beijing prepared for Trump's final madness, hysteria on China policy," end quote. In the article, it included, quote, "We can't expect Biden to cancel all policies made by the Trump administration. That would be naive. China is fully prepared for more conflicts with the new administration. The Biden administration will only fix Trump's policies if it finds them damaging US interests. Being prepared for the long fight is always the wise choice for China," end quote. In a recent forum, former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said the incoming Biden administration must restore lines of communication with China in order to prevent a global crisis. Quote, "Unless there is some basis for some cooperative action, the world will slide into catastrophe comparable with World War I. America and China are now drifting increasingly towards confrontation, and they're conducting their diplomacy in a confrontational way. The danger is that some crisis will occur that will go beyond rhetoric into actual military conflict," end quote. Kissinger had this to say about the Trump White House, quote, "Trump has a more confrontational method of negotiation that you can apply indefinitely. It was important to him to emphasize the deep concerns Americans have about the evolution of the world economy that is not balanced. I think that was important to emphasize, but since then I would have preferred a more differentiated approach," end quote. This week, too, the Office of the State Department in the United States published a policy document entitled, quote, "The Elements of the China Challenge," end quote, which offers a framework for US policy towards China going forward. I will include the link in the PDF below. It's quite an interesting document, and it could well be used in a Biden administration as a framework for a new US policy towards China. The policy document's executive summary begins, quote, "Awareness has been growing in the United States and in nations around the world that the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has triggered a new era of great power competition. Yet few discern the pattern in China's inroads within every region of the world, much less the specific form of dominance to which the party aspires," end quote. The document argues that, quote, "To secure freedom, America must refashion its foreign policy in light of 10 tasks," end quote. These include, quote, "secure freedom at home," end quote, "maintain the world's most powerful military," and, quote, "fortify the free, open, and rules-based international order that it led in creating," it here being the United States, "after World War II," end quote, "and re-evaluate its alliance system as well as other tasks." Like I said, the document is well worth a read, and I'll include the PDF link in the description below. Next up, I'm going to try something new. This is the quote of the week. I'm going to have to try and make an animation for it. So basically, I'm thinking perhaps once a week I'm going to have a quote from a senior official or a influential media personality or someone in China, and this will sort of reflect on a basic development of some sort, but I won't actually do a deep dive. I'll just read the quote. So this is the quote of the week for this week, and it's on Hong Kong. The quote is, quote, Hong Kong cherishes core values such as democracy, freedom, and human rights. But before we talk about core values of Hong Kong, we have to talk about patriotism. Hong Kong is part of the People's Republic of China. We should only allow patriots to rule Hong Kong. Went on to say, quote, some cliches have been repeated recently. People say that one country, two systems and the rule of law are dead. We have heard too much. Let these curses become the historical record of how some people slapped their own faces. And let these noises become the background music as Hong Kong embraces changes and enters a new era. End quote. Over the weekend, the National Association of Financial Market Institutional Investors said it had launched a quote-unquote self-disciplinary investigation into Yongcheng Coal and Electricity Holding Group Co. Limited. This comes after the state-owned coal mining company in central China's Henan province defaulted on a 1 billion RMB ultra-short-term bond less than a month after it was issued. The default caused initial shock in the domestic bond market, as many investors, institutional and retail alike, view state-owned enterprise bonds as implicitly backed by the government, local or otherwise, and as such as safe investments. Over the last few days, several other high-profile companies have defaulted on large bonds, including BMW's China venture partner, Brilliance, which saw a $150 million bond default, as well as the Chinese chipmaker Tsinghua Uni Group, which defaulted on a $200 million bond. Now, note these bonds are internal within the country, domestic bonds, and they are in RMB, not US dollars. I've only given them to you in US dollars for your convenience. Some see these defaults as a sign that government bailouts of distressed state companies, once taken for granted by most investors, can no longer be guaranteed, hitting market confidence hard. At least 20 Chinese companies have suspended planned bond sales worth approximately $240 billion or 15.5 billion RMB over the past week alone, as these high-profile defaults have unnerved some investors. Other investors, however, especially vulture funds, still believe that the government will not allow the situation to deteriorate too much, because this would undermine top political objectives of maintaining economic and social stability, and so are willing to make moral hazard speculative bets that the government will step in, and so they buy junk bonds for cents on the dollar. For example, one investor quoted by the Financial Times this week expressed, quote, if they let Yongcheng or Brilliance go under, no state firms in Henan or Liaoning will ever be able to tap the bond market again. The government won't let that happen. End quote. Early in the week, the central bank announced that it was pumping over $110 billion worth of RMB into the medium-term bond market, a move that many see as a response to recent events in order to ease market tensions and revive market confidence. Watch this space. This story is still developing. Now for an update on the ongoing situation with China-Australia relations. Of course, the relationship is at a very, very low point. We've been following this all year, so I don't want to recover what we've already discussed in previous episodes of China Update. But this week, what I did want to touch on is this week, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian did something interesting. He reiterated Beijing's position that poor relations with Australia are all Australia's fault, saying, quote, the responsibility for causing this situation doesn't lie with China at all, end quote. But he also, interestingly, gave a detailed list of the things that Australia did to upset Beijing, which resulted in brutal trade sanctions, among other responses. These reasons should not be surprising to us. We have been discussing this deterioration this year, and we've pointed out what steps Australia did to anger Beijing and the response they got from Beijing, especially the economic response. But it is surprising to see them explicitly identified here by a ministry spokesperson. Now, as I read this quote from Zhao Lijian, try to put yourself in the shoes of officials and foreign policy makers in developed nations that have a high degree of dependency, a trade dependency with China. What would they be thinking as they read a statement like this? So these are the reasons why Australia has been hit with trade sanctions and why the relationship is at its worst point probably in decades. Here is Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian giving the official reasons here. Quote, first, the Australian side, in blatant violation of the basic norms of international relations, has time and again made mistakes on issues concerning China's core interests like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Taiwan. It also exploited platforms like the Human Rights Council to initiate or participate in joint actions against China on Xinjiang-related issues, meddled in the national security legislation of Hong Kong in a high-profile way, and endorsed Taiwan's attempt to force its way into the World Health Assembly. Second, in the absence of any evidence, some people in Australia slandered and accused China of engaging in so-called intervention or infiltration activities in Australia. There was no justification for the politicalization and stigmatization of normal exchanges and cooperation between China and Australia. Here's they're referring to primarily national security legislation that Australia introduced a few years ago in order to make it more difficult for foreign donors and foreign agents to influence internal politics and elections in Australia. A purely internal issue, or an internal affair, as the Chinese may put it. I'll continue with the quote. Quote, third, Australia has engaged in political manipulation on the pandemic by promoting the so-called independent international inquiry, which seriously interfered with international cooperation on pandemic prevention and control. China must feel very confident about the power of its market as a tool of political influence to kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, as the Chinese saying goes. That is, make an example of someone, as they are doing here with the Australians. This strategy comes with risk, of course, especially in the current international environment. Perhaps Australia's capitalists will put profits before country and put pressure on Canberra to play ball with Beijing. We will see. Although on Tuesday, Australia signed a landmark military agreement with Japan, which would, quote, allow more maritime war games, military aviation exercises, and the stationing of troops in each other's countries. Okay guys, that is our China update for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. I will hopefully see you guys in a few days. As always, stay safe, stay sane, and I will see you next time on China Update. Sound check. Other investors, however, oh shit, I need to make some room. That it led, it here being America, in creating still believe that the government will not allow the situation to deteriorate